So I hope everybody's on line for the next panel, Confronting Colonial Pasts, Envisioning Creative Futures, Collaboratively Researching the Collections from Namibia at the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, by Larissa Förster, Julia Binter, and Golda Ha-Eiros. Larissa Förster is a social anthropologist, and she's the head of the newly established Department for Cultural Goods in Collections from Colonial Contexts at the German Lost Art Foundation in Berlin, but she's also associate member of the Center for Anthropological Research at the Humboldt University. Julia Binter is also a social anthropologist, a provenance researcher at the Städtisches Museum zu Berlin, and a lead researcher in the project Confronting Colonial Pasts, Envisioning Creative Futures. And Golda Ha-Eiros, their partner in this panel, is the curator for the National Museum of Namibia, responsible for the anthropology collections. So without further waiting, we'll give them the floor if they're online.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Golda.
Julia. Morning, Julia, Larissa.
Fantastic. So, yeah. I'm going to do a small prologue, so to say, before I actually hand over to Golda and Julia for the talk about the collaborative work and the kind of decolonized type of provenance research that we did in this project. And the prologue is the following. It should actually be Jeremy Sylvester from the Museums Association of Namibia standing or sitting here and introducing the project, because he's been the driving force behind it. He's been something like Spiritus Rector. And indeed, he somehow kicked it off with his initiative, Man's Initiative of Africa Accession, that was born in 2014. So the project actually owes its existence to him. But Jeremy Sylvester did not manage to defeat the COVID-19 virus, and he passed away in July of this year. So it's a very tragic situation, and Jeremy leaves a huge void that, of course, cannot just be filled in any way. So we really mourn this passing of his, but we try to carry on with the project in the best way, and in the spirit of his efforts and of his passion for German Namibian collections work. We've come to the conclusion that what we can do is talk about the genesis of the project. We cannot represent this perspective, but we can talk about the genesis of the project. So we take a little bit of a different approach than the first project. And I've been asked to do this from my perspective as someone who's been working for many years on the memory of colonialism in Germany, in Namibia, and the different cultures of remembrance in both countries. And we believe that it's really important to understand this because of the complex political field and history of German-Namibian relations. And that's a field that also Museums Association of Namibia, National Museum of Namibia, Ethnological Museum Berlin, all these institutions and all cooperation partners have in one way or the other to navigate. And at the same time, it's also the motivation, it's been the motivation to do this project. And I think it's also a possibility. I'm going to draft for you this historical and political background in the next few minutes. So you can assess for yourself how this project sits within this whole configuration of German-Namibian historical relations and also relationships between institutions and also the entangled history of collections. And then you can assess and what kind of decolonizing work this project may, and we hope, will be able to do in view also of the broader German-Namibian relations. So let me go to my first slide, and Brian, maybe you can put this here. It's interesting because I don't see it. Yes, good, thank you very much. So the project that we'll be talking about is called Confronting Colonial Pasts, Envisioning Creative Futures, collaboratively researching the collections from Namibia at the Ethnologisches Museum Berlin. Next slide, please. Yeah. So as I said, the background of Germany and Namibia as a shared / divided history, and that's actually that quote is taken from an exhibition in Cologne in Berlin, 2004, an exhibition that I had the pleasure to co-curate. And this term, a shared divided history, really wants to point to the ambivalences of that history, the violence in that history, and how it brings us together, but how it also separates these two countries because of the very different experiences. I'm just going to run through this slide. There have been resolutions of the German Parliament that there is a special relationship, that's what it was called, between Germany and Namibia because of the colonial, Namibia having been a colony of Germany. And I just wanted to remind you that the core debate is around the colonial war that Germany waged in Namibia that escalated into a genocide. So this war took place between 1904 and 1908 and then escalated into this genocide. In 2006, there was actually a motion, not a resolution, by the Namibian National Assembly to seek redress for this genocide. And that's a very important point in this whole debate. 2015, years or even decades after campaigning, in particular of descendants of the victim groups, the German government informally recognized the genocide. And I'm saying informally because it's still something in between a recognition and the genocide and a qualification of those events as, and I quote, genocide in today's terms. So we have this, still this not fully official wording accepted yet. In May 2020, the intergovernmental negotiations that were started in 2015 were concluded with a joint declaration between the two countries, and the declaration stipulated that the two countries wanted to embark upon measures to heal the wounds of the past and create a lasting partnership for the future. I mean, this is the original wording, and it includes an apology, 1.1 million grant to be administered, euro grant to be administered by a joint trust or fund and to be spent on the affected regions in Namibia. And it also comprises the establishment of a binational commission. It's just very important to know that this declaration has been criticized a lot. There's a heated debate going on, in particular in Namibia. It's been criticized for its procedure and its outcome. So it has not been accepted yet by the National Assembly in Namibia. I'm talking about this because I think it's really crucial to know that this political negotiations and also the pressure that is in the background of how Namibian history and German colonial history is discussed in Germany. Next slide, please. And I think another important background is the restitutions and repatriations that have taken place between Germany and Namibia in 2011, 2014, and 2018. The human remains of 81 individuals Namibian individuals were returned from German institutions like Charité universities of Freiburg, Greifswald, and Jena, and a number of them had been abducted in German Southwest Africa's concentration camps. That means during the colonial war and the genocide. In 2018, we saw the return of the Bible and the whip of anti-colonial resistance fighter Hendrik Witbooi from the Linden Museum in Stuttgart. That was the first actual very prominent return of an artifact from a German museum to Namibia, and it had to do with Baden-Württemberg's Namibia initiative that was set up a couple of years ago. And then in 2019, we saw the return of the Padrow, the stone cross from Cape Cross from the German Historical Museum in Germany to Namibia. So you've got this history of returns of very significant yet single objects. Next slide, please. So when talking about the history or the genesis of the projects, and thinking about what is the interests that come together when projects, collaborative projects like these are conceptualized, and when cooperation partners enter into exchange and dialogue and write applications together, it's important to talk about what is the interest that everyone brings to the table. And I would say, on the German side, it's been a general lack of knowledge about research on and display of artifacts from Namibia. And this was in spite of these very heated discussions about colonialism, genocide, repatriation, and reparation that I mentioned. And we had the feeling that we really need to address this blind spot. There had been exhibitions before in Stuttgart, for example, in Cologne, in Berlin, but Namibian objects had never been really prominently shown in these museums, let alone in their permanent exhibitions, probably because the objects did not conform to what a Western gaze has come to construct as masterpieces of African art, for example. So here's also our first criticism of Western museum practice. Then the whole debate on collections from colonial contexts was going on in Germany, and it had its first climax in 2017. The Ethnological Museum in Berlin made its plannings for the Humboldt Forum, the much criticized reconstructed Berlin Castle in the center of Berlin, where the ethnological collections have their exhibition spaces. And as you may know, the Humboldt Forum opened in late September, so it's very new. And the debate has been ongoing since 2002, when this all had been decided by the German parliament. And against this whole background, I think the idea that Drummer Sylvester, Jonathan Fine, the then curator of Western and Southern African collections at the Ethnological Museum, developed was the idea of setting objects free as a way of generating new knowledge and generating new relationships, as a proactive way of doing this. I think it's here where I should maybe hand over to Golda, so you can describe what on the Namibian part were interests and motivations that explain for the history of the project. Or should I continue? Golda, are you with us?
No. Yes, I'm here. Hang on, let me just switch off my video because my network is very poor. Okay. Is it on this slide? Oh, I don't see anything.
I can. Do you see the slide?
No, I can. Yeah, I can see it. Yeah. I see it.
We had to
Okay.
put this slide together on last minute just for the public to know, because there were so many emergencies in the background for all of us.
Exactly. All right. So initially, what had happened was that I think the historical collections from Namibia, like you mentioned, in the Ethnological Museum, were mainly acquired during the German colonial period, and the existence of these objects have been researched since 2012, with, like you mentioned, the birth of Africa Accession project, and then in 2019, jointly with Namibian heritage practitioners in different parts of Namibia and in different what I say industries, came together to identify some of the objects that were in the collection. I know that we all saw that the collections reflected often extremely violent processes of colonial acquisition, but also there was a lot of trading. And in addition, we saw the creativity and the genuity of Namibian people in some of these objects. I think coming onto the project, our main concerns were having a deeper understanding of the objects in terms of, especially those ones that we don't see anymore, but also what were they used for in the past and what are they used for today? What were their historical backgrounds of these objects, and also just trying to establish symbolic connections, reconnect them. But then I think one thing that came out evidently was that we still use some of these objects, and we have a responsibility of safeguarding our culture and our heritage, and this was, for example, done through reinforcing already existing networks that were established by Jeremy Sylvester. So I think collectively we worked on this, like it mentions, with Jonathan and Julia and Jeremy. And I think you can see here that we entered the collections and we were able to physically touch the objects, have a sense of their weight, the material, the craftsmanship, have an appreciation of that. Here you see a list of the teams, both Namibia and German, that formed this project, that were part of this project. Next slide, please. And here we are in the office just really discussing these objects and what it means. And I think what came out here was that we needed to give these objects their traditional name, because we identified that there was so much missing in the, I don't want to say inventory list, but in the accession books, or yeah. And that meant us having to sit in the office and call back home. And I remember one of the colleagues, Dr. Washali, having to call her mom and ask about a specific doll that she had seen. And even her mom hadn't seen it, and she was thinking, oh, maybe it's witchcraft, And I think she even said there's so much time has passed that some of the objects we really don't have any idea. And that is why it's so important to just do the research, the needed research in Namibia back home with the source communities. And it was a lot of WhatsApp calls and a lot of sending pictures and photographs, and just really creating an understanding for ourselves as to our immaterial culture. Because back home, we create something and then you use it, and then it serves its purpose. But now that it's was in a museum and it's been kept for so long, I think, like I was saying, we have that responsibility to do the research and do the work and let the communities know about the lifestyles that we lived in the past. The next slide. Oh, maybe before Julia takes over, I just also wanted to mention about when we entered the collection. I think there was just so much emotion involved, and we hadn't taken in account how what is the word, the emotional toll that it took on us, especially when you look at some objects and you realize how, and you think about how the object was actually taken. Like some of the objects were toys, kids' toys, intimate objects, sacred objects, and your mind goes amiss and you're just wondering in what position that person must have been put in order to give that object up, you know. So there were a lot of tears shed, especially with some of the colleagues that grew up in that era or closely with a relative that experienced that era. Yeah, Julia, you can take over.
Thank you so much, Golda. I think you can already see the stark contrast between this very Eurocentric graph of a chronology of acquisitions of the museum versus Golda's very profound and very true acknowledgement of the emotional toll it took on all of us. I cried with you. It was working with these kinds of objects, particularly with objects that were taken during violent, during war, during genocide, can be very traumatic, and it can put the finger on wounds that you might not even have known that they were there or that you had never dared to touch. So it was indeed a very emotional process, and it was also a process where different forms of knowledge collided, and we had to find a way of translation between, for example, this graph and the knowledge and the emotions that we all brought to the table. What you can see here is a first outline for us, an overview of when objects actually entered the museum collections, and from then on ask questions of what might have been the context in which these objects were taken. And for us, we felt, as the Berlin team, we felt a responsibility to really look into the ways in which the collections were connected, not only to colonial violence, but particularly to the genocide against the Ovaherero and Nama. And our first surprise was that despite the fact that all loot from wars, colonial wars, were first coming to Berlin, to the Ethnological Museum there, and then distributed to other museums in Germany, there was very little from the colonial wars in Namibia that reached the museum in Berlin. On the contrary, there were very early collections already acquired in the 1870s by missionaries that made quite a considerable bulk of the collection, and that also came to be the objects and the material culture, the heritage that Golda and Neoa and Abebo and Cynthia and all the other researchers were interested in. And for us, what it meant to do collaborative provenance research was, in fact, the way in which we not only saw our responsibility and were clear of where we were standing, where we were coming from, also the institution and the politics that were involved in which we were working. Larissa already mentioned the very contested Humboldt Forum, but equally important, it was equally important that we listen and we learn what are the interests and needs of our research partners. And that's how, let me take you to the next slide. We would now like to give you some ideas of how we tried to not only forged this process of translation of our different forms of knowledge, but also how we actually tackled the colonial archive that we were working with, which is, as you all know, a very Eurocentric archive, an archive that was written by white men, very often with a very racist mindset, and with collections with very little information. And the earlier presentation so powerfully put it. We know so little about these objects. It's not a Maori club. It is a taonga. And it's the same here with the collections from Namibia. Sometimes not even the names of the people that are connected to the objects are actually correct. And that's why I would like to hand over to Golda again, because she was the one who brought this topic up, not just in our research, but also in the exhibition that we curated together. Golda?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay. I was just saying, apart from the collection that is in Berlin, the National Art Gallery, where I currently work, also has similar objects. I think one of the things that we wanted to do was also to bring the selected Berlin together with the collection at the National Museum, as a the Namibian material and immaterial cultural heritage, to also unblock that creative potential of the colonial collections from Namibia that are in Berlin. Like if you look at this Uros, I know it's listed as a tortoise shell, but if you were to say tortoise shell here, they would know what it is. I mean, the youth would know what it is, but the elders wouldn't. And I think it was so important that we give it ethnic names and we give it what the object was used for. And that's what we try to do. We try to find connections, or we selected objects with connections, like the tortoise shell, which is a unifying, I see it as a unifying object because a lot of cultures use it within Namibia, and they use it as perfume boxes or storage boxes, whereas the Himba or the Herero people would put okra in it, and the Namara Damara people would use it as to put a scent perfume, traditional perfume in it, and the San people use it as a decorative object on their attires. And I think having these explanations that we got from the communities, which I think is so important because it is actually their voices that we try to display even within the exhibition, and they are the ones that actually use these objects. So it was really important to have their voices in it, and through their stories we were able to learn that how this perfume was made, how okra was made, the importance of having a tortoise shell, especially when you go out into the field. Like in the previous slide, you saw the tortoise shell was with a, they call it a rousseau, but it's called a bag. I would also say it's also called a bag. So when you're in the field, when you do collect dried leaves and seeds and buttons that you find in the field, you have a pouch to put it in, and it's tied around your waist. I remember an elder narrating that the tortoise shell at times was given to a female after the perfume was made by the female. It would be gifted back, And I think whilst we were researching, we realized that how the patterns of the tortoise shell had been used for so many other, or had influenced so many other patterns, especially when we looked at the blanket, this amazingly huge, delicate blanket, knitted together, put together with leather, different shades of leather. I mean, I can't imagine how much leather had to be available to do this, or if it was stitched one time, like pieces by pieces because the shades are so different. But it was really interesting having to find out that this creativity existed prior to missionaries, prior to any settlers that had come about, And I think in books you learn so much about how the missionaries introduced our people to sewing, but the date on this blanket says something else. So I think the provenance research was also very, very important in this project particularly because we've been doing this, and it was a way of life for us, and it still continues still today. I think Julia and Moritz, who came down to Namibia to do the film, had an opportunity to witness one of the Omas in Okombai making this patchwork dress. It wasn't made out of leather because obviously leather is extremely, extremely expensive today. And it was made out of bits and pieces of off-cut cloth. And she invited us into her home. And with her grandmother's machine, she started putting together this, completing the dress that she had started. And she was just saying, this is a skill this is like the only skill she knows that was passed down onto her from her grandmother, and that's why she takes pride in wearing this traditional attire, and it saddens her today when she sees the younger youth and young ladies wearing clothing that they buy in stores, because that dress speaks of pride of your traditions and your cultures, and she would want to see us wear it more often, and not only at ceremonial events like we do when you have a funeral or a wedding, but just as an everyday dress. So that was really interesting to know. And like I was saying, I find it so important for community voices to come out and not to only use community as information points, but for them to take ownership of it. And I think it would be so much easier for us to preserve and conserve this heritage, this cultural heritage of ours, if the community was involved and is involved. Yeah. Next slide, Julia.
I actually have to go back.
No, it's fine. You can.
Maybe I can. Unfortunately,
Yeah,
Cynthia
you can
Schimming,
continue.
who will, whose example I will talk about next, can't join us today, but I hope I render her justice by telling you how I experienced her journey working as an artist, as a fashion designer, and as a Herero German woman, with the kind of family heritage that comes with that in the collections in Berlin. And she taught me a lot about what it means to engage with embodied forms of knowledge and how they might completely counteract things that the Eurocentric, the colonial archive might say about certain objects. And in particular, see if that works. Okay. Here. You can see here Cynthia holding and also caressing. So again, we're back to caressing, taking care of a small doll. And Cynthia found this doll in our depot with her face lying down. And she took her up, and I was there with her. It was a hugely important and emotional moment for her, because Cynthia then told me that she had made a doll like this with her grandma, because back then it was her grandma who were teaching her how to make dresses like this. And dresses like this would mean a dress that Herero women are known for today, which is the so-called traditional dress of Herero women in the 20th and 21st centuries, which means a gown in a Victorian style dress from the 19th century with huge puffed arms. And she would also tell me stories about while she was sewing this doll herself, she would ask her grandma, why do we Herero women wear so many petticoats? And her grandma would tell her that Herero women wore these many petticoats because they didn't want to get raped. And at this point, a lot of trauma that was carried through generations of colonial violence, particularly against women, was made present again and was with us and stayed with us. And we had to find a way of working through this. And Cynthia really pestered me to find out how this doll came into the museum. How was it acquired? And so I went to the archive of the Vereinigte Evangelische Mission, a missionary archive in Wuppertal in West Germany, and dug through 10 years of correspondence between Karl Gottlieb Büttner, the missionary that was stationed at one of the capitals of the Over-Herero people in the 1870s, in Oshimbingwe, with his wife and his mother-in-law. So those were the whole mission at this point in time. And who acquired, besides the doll, 118 other objects from Herero, Nungquen, and also Nama people. And he didn't mention objects or material culture once, but at the very end in 1878, he says, now that I'm leaving the mission, I've started collecting and my house now looks like a museum, and plus some other racist remarks about material culture that he had just acquired. And in a publication, he then explains that first people didn't want to exchange the objects for the kinds of imported things that he would normally exchange for to get food, local food and supplies. But in the end, he had to sell his cattle because he left the country, and cattle was the most precious and most valued good for particularly the Over-Herero and Over-Herero people. So then he was finally able to exchange his cattle for the objects that are now at the Ethnological Museum in Berlin. And I told Cynthia that, and I told her, look, at least the German missionary put it in writing that this doll might have been exchanged for cattle. And Cynthia acknowledged that, but she still asked, so how come that, I mean, at least for her doll was her most precious possession when she was a child. So how come that a Herero girl at the missionary station would willingly give away a doll like this? And there are lots of questions about generation of the status of children in societies 150 years ago in colonial settings. And I think Cynthia pinpoints to a lot of people and personalities that are very easily overlooked when we're talking about material culture and colonial history, because what we have in the European archive is white men, maybe women, and maybe, in this case, Namibian men. But children, women were most often not even mentioned in the archive. So we need somebody like Cynthia who can tell us her story and the story of dolls like this for women in her family and in the Herero community more largely. And she took all of this, the trauma of intergenerational trauma of violence against women and so on, and created this art installation that can be seen now at the Humboldt Forum. It's a site-specific intervention, and as you can see here on the left-hand side, she remained within the canon of so-called traditional Herero dressing, which is the Victorian dress that you see here. But on the rim of it, of the skirt, you actually see the kind of beautifully embellished garments that Herero women wear before missionary contact, before the genocide, which were for example, écuries. It's too long to really explain all of it, but écuries, which were made out of leather and embellished with iron beads and so on. And she took other inspiration from basketry, from the northern parts of Namibia, to weave the belt of this garment, and also used different forms of textiles to refer to other parts of Namibia in other cultural contexts. And the second part, and maybe we can leave that for the discussion, is on the one hand a landscape, and and on the other hand a blanket, the blanket that Golda just talked about, the blanket that had the pattern of the tortoise shell. And Cynthia used the colonial photographic archive that she also found here in Berlin to repopulate the landscape that was depopulated by genocide, by war, and also by colonial photography, because one of the topoi of colonial photography was the kind of empty landscapes, particularly after the genocide, that would invite German settlers to come to the new colony and settle there. And Cynthia took that up. She got very angry and she took that up and she said, look, you know what? I will repopulate this landscape and I will show everyone that, and I quote her here, I will show everyone that has been shaping Namibia to this day. And those are Herero, Nama, Damara, Onunkwen, and also the Germans. And yeah, I think she's found a powerful way of translating all of her research, of her artistic research, her personal intergenerational experiences, her embodied knowledge into this multi-layered artwork. Now I would like to hand over to Golda again, and she will give you a more detailed overview of what our exhibition is all about. Golda. Golda, are you there? Okay, then maybe we can wait for 1 second. Good to have you back, Golda.
Okay.
Golda? If not, maybe I can just give my take and then Golda can tie in as soon as she's back online. Yeah, what we have been talking about so far is the genesis of the project, the very long genesis of the project, and then the kind of research, the kind of collaborative provenance research that we undertook as a German Namibian team in the spring and summer of 2019. And we tried to create a very open process and a safe space to research the collections, to tap into these histories that can be re-traumatizing as well. And we were also very clear about the needs and interests that we brought to the table as the Berlin team. And for us, one of the interests or needs was to make an exhibition about the project or with the project, with our research partners. And very early on, Golda and Neoa and Dababushali and so on they approached us with an idea that I found riveting and freeing in a sense, which was to not show objects, particularly in the context of the Humboldt Forum, which, as critics often point out, is like a treasure trove itself. It's a rebuilt castle of a monarchy that has been long gone, a monarchy that stands for the colonial history of Germany. And given the fact that the Namibian collections had not been on show ever in Berlin, the question was, why now? You know, just because a castle is rebuilt, aren't there other people, particularly in Namibia, that might be interested in these objects, which they might not even call objects, you know, that they might call oros and not tortoiseshell. And that's why very early onwards we thought to establish a process where objects could go back, and we decided that we would rather do an exhibition about our research project rather than showing and displaying objects, maybe with a a label, which would be the traditional way of co-curating. And what Julie said, co-curation can't be co-displaying. And you've already seen Cynthia's artwork. That was a key part of it. And the other idea was that we will also not show an empty museum, because an empty museum is also the key fear, of repatriation. What will happen? Will the European museums suddenly become empty? What can we show? How can we engage with our audiences? And we tried to face these kinds of fears heads on and said, no, look, what we're gaining is so much more when we let objects go free, if we let objects travel. And we tried to find a symbol, a kind of visualization of what we gain. And we called it a so-called network of knowledge. And in the vitrines that were already predestined for us in the Humboldt Forum, we then actually knotted such a network of knowledge with the two materials that also connect the colonial and post-colonial, the colonial past and the post-colonial present. It's the leather that was used for garments, for clothing, for jewelry, for accessories before missionary and colonial contact, and the cloth, the textiles that are used today. And on this web of knowledge, network of knowledge, we hung photographs on plexiglass of these objects on knots, and they are connected to the different forms of knowledge that we all brought to the table. So Cynthia would talk about her experience with the doll, which actually gave a name, Watunwa, which means touched. And in the exhibition, she's asking, who has touched this doll? Who touched Herero women during colonial violence, during colonial wars? Who has touched this doll in Berlin? And who might be the ones that will touch her once the doll Watuna will return to Namibia? Or there are other stories that I might be able to tell you in the Q&A. It was very important for us that all of these statements, all of these forms of knowledge have a name to it, that the visitors know who the people are that brought this knowledge to the table, and that there's no hierarchy. So I'm standing with my knowledge that I could critically reconstruct from the colonial archive, next to Cynthia, next to Golda, who's asking and criticizing the kinds of knowledge that she found in the museum. And at least the first weeks of the opening, it's very interesting to see that this kind of challenging display, lots of things to read, not the original objects there. So, lots of fears that might have been brought to the table beforehand actually works quite well, and people are engaging with it. They spend quite a long time engaging with what Golda has to say, what Neoa, what Cynthia has to say. They are listening to and watching the film that Moritz Fehr did while accompanying our research in Berlin and also in Namibia, which is 20 minutes long and way too long, we were told, for a film in an exhibition. So yeah, we are quite happy that this kind of productive refusal is actually productive also for the visitors in the Humboldt Forum. And I think if Golda is not back, I would like to hand over to Larissa, who will now give a glimpse into the future of the project.
So can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I mean, just for you to understand this very complex project, because I think it was years, it really developed from a very small thing. Africa accessioned in 2014 and then gained momentum. And now we are at the point where we are with the opening of the Humboldt Forum behind us. And then what is ahead is actually the return of objects, because that was the key thought in the beginning, as I had said, of setting objects free to select between 20 and 30 objects and send them back to Namibia in order to inspire conversations, inspire collaboration, exchange, but maybe also inspire claims for restitution. So all that is open now, is an open situation. And those objects that you've seen are the representations of objects, these photographs on the plexiglass that you've seen in that slide. These objects, the originals, are actually, we plan to send back, or the museum plans to send back to Namibia next year if COVID allows. So that's this initial idea of a return. And that is then, it's kind of a second part of the project. And it will hopefully instigate a new round of conversations between all of us. So here's a slide that tries to recap who's the actors, who's the collaborating institutions in this project: the Ethnologisches Museum, the Museums Association of Namibia, the National Museum. Golda already mentioned that the National Museum has a small collection of ethnographic objects, and it was from the very beginning of the project, one of the aims was to reconnect that collection with other collections in Europe and look at these collections, how they cut across boundaries of countries, cut across histories and historical eras. And then also the University of Namibia has come in because they've got this program on heritage conservation. And there will be research by young scholars on objects, on also Namibian traditions and regimes of care and preservation of objects. And then there will be the Museum of Namibian Fashion, and that's a totally new, I would say, leg of this project. So all the knowledge that has been created and co-created in the project will flow into a new museum, a regional museum in Otjiwarongo. And this is one of the special interests and also portfolios of Museums Association of Namibia, to foster and support and promote regional museums. And it's a museum of Namibian fashion because, as I indicated earlier, this collection in Berlin and many other collections of Namibian artifacts in Germany, they contain a lot of objects from the everyday lives of Namibians back then. And that means, in particular, objects that you can wear or carry on your body, as the container that we've seen, or the blanket that we've seen in the exhibition. So they're closely linked to everyday, or we're closely linked to everyday life, and in particular jewelry and clothing styles. So they do what Julia I think said before. They actually contain a history of Namibian design and clothing, and the Museum of Namibian Fashion will go into that direction deeper and discuss Namibian design and fashion histories. So this is something that's being developed at the moment. It's been delayed by Corona, as you can imagine. So all these things we try to keep together, but also the aim of the project and all in the team is to allow for much freedom in this, for the particular interests to unfold in those different legs and parts of the project, to accommodate different disciplines, backgrounds of knowledge, different language backgrounds, different interests in this German Namibian entangled history. So, I mean, we can discuss that in the Q&A a bit further. It's really very complex, and we could just, give you a couple of glimpses at what the different aspects and spaces of negotiation in the project are. Let me just ask Golda, have you managed to log on again? It seems not. I guess not.
About 5 minutes.
Yeah. So this is also our last slide. We wanted to talk about the perspectives, the different perspectives that the project will develop in the future. And I wonder, Julia, would you like to do the first points and then I take over?
Sure. Thanks. What's really key, and I think it echoes of what Khadija, Julie, and the others said about their project, is how can we co-create knowledge in the sense that we listen and learn from each other, and we really are open to different forms of knowledge, not just written knowledge, past and present, but embodied knowledge, performative knowledge, the kind of knowledge that all history can teach us. And I think every project has to find their own ways of translation because they're working with different forms of knowledge. But the key aim is to find ways that work for all people involved. And the second is that these kinds of collaborative research projects can and should not be short-term projects. It's a relationship building process, and this can only work if they are sustainable. So, and what's more, the project is growing. Obviously, once the objects will return to Namibia, people are now preparing the ground for that. The infrastructure at the National Museum, the Gerda Henkel Foundation funding provided a museologist, a conservator for the National Museum to prepare the ground to welcome these objects, because there isn't an infrastructure there yet, like in New Zealand, and there are also no like fixed procedures of how to welcome objects back. So this is actually a way. These 23 objects are a way of testing the ground. What do our research partners in Namibia need to be able to welcome not only these 23 objects, but many more objects in the future. And obviously to make sure that as many people as possible in Namibia, not just, academics and artists, but community members from all walks of life, have access and can work with these objects. Larissa, would you like to continue?
So the return of the artifacts, and they are being, at the moment, it's planned to return them on a kind of loan contract, but we hope for this return to be a trailblazer for more returns, and that could include permanent, full, returns, also of legal ownership to these objects. And for us, that was so important, and it's also for all in the team to use this as a way of imagining possible futures for the objects. You know, what could their future life be about? Their re-encounter with their people, and also the re-encounters that these objects have the power to create and engender, you know, between us as collaborating scholars, as collaborating institutions, as, let's say, perpetrators, descendants of a perpetrator society and descendants of the victim group. So to really reimagine these futures. I can say my role since I've been, and I'm sorry that I did not explain that in more detail in the beginning, I've been an academic scientific advisor to the project because of those long-standing relationships with Namibian scholars and institutions. I kind of work more in the background while Julia and Golda are the project, and the rest of the team is the project, more or less. But what I've tried, or I'll try to do, is to put the Berlin collection in perspective for Namibian stakeholders. So the German Lost Art Foundation is currently conducting a pilot study, a very basic overview on the number and kinds of Namibian artifacts held by museums in Germany. So by working through the Namibian collection, we realized that we need to have, in order to assess, you know, what is significant objects that are of significance for, let's say, a whole nation or large groups of people, we should actually get a deeper insight into what German collections hold in the first place, to also make selections and well-informed decisions on what could be and should be returned. So at the moment we are conducting this pilot study as a background project. And then I think the last point is again for Golda and Julia to elaborate on, because that's in your, it's what you created, this exhibition at the Humboldt Forum. So I hand back again.
Okay, thank you very much, Larissa, but we've gone over time, so could we please wrap it up and pass on question and answers, please, because people are here waiting in the room. So thank you very much, Larissa, thank you, Golda, and thank you, Julia. Any question from the floor?
No question for the floor, and there is no question also on the Q&A.
Okay, so I would like to ask one. Thank you very much, by the way, for this very detailed presentation. Beside your project, another project that's very well known is are the research projects around the Benin collections, and somehow we may get a picture, if we're not in Germany, that most of the research in provenance and most of the collaboration with Africa today is about Benin and Namibia. Are in fact your project one among many projects with African countries, source communities, museums, or is it a pilot project? Is it inspiring new ones to come, or are you planning from this project to extend, to broaden the scope of your work?
Maybe I can start from an institutional point of view. I'm a member of a team of 4 provenance researchers. And that's quite unique because we've got permanent positions in Germany. Larissa, and she can talk about this maybe also a little bit, she's the one funding provenance research on a 1 or 2 year basis on a lot of other museums in Germany. And you also have to differentiate between the politics and the public debate and the research that we're doing actually in the museum, because most of the time they might not even go together. it took us quite a long time for the press to take up the Namibia project, because everyone was focused on Benin and the so-called punitive expedition, the attack, the war of the British against the Kingdom of Benin in what today is Nigeria. And in fact, there have been a lot of other projects, including collaborative provenance research projects going on at the Ethnological Museum in Berlin. For example, one run by Paula Ivanov and Christine Weber-Sinn, a colleague of mine of this provenance research team, on the collections from Tanzania, also a former German colony, which has been running for 5 years now. And they're also now in a collaborative project with the National Museum in Dar es Salaam, with the university in Tanzania, to find ways of bringing these collections together, of finding research questions that might be of interest to everyone involved, and to also find ways of bringing objects home. So there's been quite a lot of work done on the collections from this part of the African continent. And now there's a new curator for the West African collections, Verena Rodatos, and she's an expert on Togo. So there will be research projects also now with partners from Togo, and maybe some others from Cameroon might follow. Plus, obviously, there have been quite a few projects with First Nations in Canada, in Alaska, even restitutions, for example, to the Chukach community. So yeah, that's a lot have been going on, but the press doesn't really pick them up, because most of these cases are not as clear cut. They don't tell an easy story. You know, it's a quite easy story to say the British attacked Benin, sacked it, looted it, and now we have to bring these objects back. It's also like from a European legal framework, it's a very clear-cut case. In our case, for example, in the Namibian project, most of the objects that are of interest and that are now returning to Namibia are objects that were, at least according to the European record, sold, bought, or exchanged. That was the kind of barter trade back in the day. So from a legal point of view, there might not be the same kind of moral argument that you could bring to the fore, but rather one of cultural and historical significance of the objects. And I think that's why we're also we're listening carefully and learning from partners or from researchers in New Zealand what their arguments are for the permanent return of objects. That might also have been, part of an exchange of gifts, but are now so important historically and culturally that they should stay in New Zealand. And I think it's a similar question that is now come up in our project on the Namibian collection, and in many others that are actually done now on collection from the African continent.
And let me follow up on this. It's really like the really good thing is that we in 2019, and the different levels of politics, national government, the federal states, plus the Association of the Municipalities, released this framework principles in which they commit themselves to fostering and funding provenance research, repatriation and restitution, in particular, of human remains from colonial contexts, documentation, transparency, working together, international collaboration. So we do have this political framework, and the funds that we administer and give out to museums for provenance research have come in the vein of these debates in politics. So we are in a relatively good position that there is a lot going on. We fund projects, the German Lost Art Foundation funds projects that have collaborations with Cameroon, with Togo, with Pacific communities. So this is really a whole range of projects that are taking place. There is a working group in Germany, the working group on colonial provenances, with really a huge number of colleagues, freelance and fully employed curators that do provenance research on German collections from various regions. So at the moment, I think a lot is going on in terms of provenance research. I think return and restitution is still something that needs to be tackled so that it's not only Benin that we are talking about.
Thank you. Any question now from the floor?
I'm sorry we could not really see Golda, but we saw a little bit, and I would like to apologize for this. And I don't know, we will maybe close the discussion if there is no question, or maybe Golda, if you are listening to us, or Larissa, or Julia, if you want to add something. Maybe.
I would just say thank you. It's already been a very inspiring discussion, and I'm looking very much forward to the next presentations. Thanks a lot for inviting us.
Yes, thank you very much for your participation. It was very inspiring. As you said, this is only the beginning of the conference, and for many of us, I think, here and also online, it's also the beginning probably of new future collaborations. So thank you very much.